Hi everyone, and welcome to our week on public opinion and misinformation. So for today, we're really going to be defining what misinformation even is. Then we're going to get into what sort of underlying processes there are that make people believe in misinformation. So accuracy and directional motives specifically, how to correct misinformation, and in what circumstances that's even possible. Then we're going to talk about backfire effects. And then finally, we're going to talk about sincerity. So whether people even truly believe some of this misinformation that they even report on public opinion. So first, what does it mean to be misinformed? So being misinformed is just when someone firmly holds wrong information. So they have confidence in it and it is incorrect. This is in contrast to someone who is uninformed. So this is a person who has no factual beliefs about the topic that we're asking, the topic under inquiry. Now, being misinformed is also slightly different than belief in conspiracies. So belief in conspiracies can often fall under misinformation, but it's a specific form of misinformation, and it tends to center on a belief that political or historical events were caused by the machinations of very powerful people. Okay. And again, belief in rumors is different than belief in conspiracies, and again, probably falls a little bit more under being misinformed. So it's just a belief in statements that lack specific standards of evidence, but that gain credibility through widespread social transmission. So it's more like something you hear from a friend than necessarily something that you read in a newspaper article. But you can see how belief in conspiracies and belief in rumors are under the umbrella of misinformation, but are not the only ways in which you can be misinformed, okay? They're not the only ways in which you can be misinformed. Now, I just want to backtrack. We have touched on this a few times throughout the course of the semester, but I want to bring it back up again. And this is motivated reasoning. So motivated reasoning is people will seek out information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs, and they are going to avoid information that challenges those beliefs, right? That challenges or is inconsistent with those beliefs or values. Motivated reasoning also means that people are likely to process information with a bias towards their pre-existing views. So they are going to denigrate or disparage information that they don't agree with, but also sort of uncritically accept information that is consistent with their beliefs. So I want us to keep this in the back of our minds as we talk about misinformation, because this is something that we are all guilty of, is motivated reasoning. And in order to understand what sort of machinations, what processes make us believe misinformation, we should also understand the biases with which we operate under, okay? So like with this in the background, there are really multiple motives in how people process and accept information. So one is an accuracy motive. So an accuracy motive indicates a desire to make the correct decision, right? To answer correctly, to know something correctly. Whereas directional motives reflect the desire to arrive at a specific conclusion. So if I come across a specific piece of information that is not congruent with my current worldview, then I am likely to not go with the accuracy motive in processing this information and more rely on the directional motive. Because if I'm motivated, if I want to arrive at a specific conclusion, and I'm processing this information, then I'm really probably going to discount it and be like, oh, it's not true. Or if it's consistent with what I believe, I'm going to want to accept it. And for the most part, except under certain circumstances, directional motives are what usually how our processes work. We tend to rely more on directional motives than accuracy motives under most circumstances. This isn't always true, but under most circumstances, we will rely on directional motives instead. Now, when people come across misinformation, it's actually quite difficult to correct that misinformation once people have sort of absorbed that into their worldview or their opinion. So really the first step, if you are to correct misinformation, is to provide an alternate, obviously fact-based alternative, okay? It needs to be grounded in facts, and it needs to be an alternate explanation for the phenomenon that that individual is misinformed about. Okay, I think that's fairly intuitive. Correct how someone is wrong, but do not center the misinformation. Do not center the misinformation. Okay, and that just means don't repeat what the original wrong claim was. So a lot of times in you can think about Twitter or Facebook, particularly Twitter, someone will retweet the thing they disagree with or they say is incorrect, and then they will comment on top saying and this is why it's wrong. By retweeting the original claim, you are centering the misinformation, right? I believe your reading also points to the don't say Obama is not a Muslim, right? That still perpetuates the misinformation that was he a Muslim? No, he was not. He is not. Now, the other portion here is the correction should be from a credible source. The correction should be from a credible source. So if you're a Democrat and you hold a misinformed opinion, then it will likely help if the correct information comes from a source that you find credible. So likely someone from the Democratic Party and not the Republican Party, and vice versa is also true. If you are a Republican and you hold a misinformed view, then it likely helps if you receive correct information from a source that you believe in, like a Republican, okay? Now, the thing to remember, though, is that sometimes, and this is only sometimes, this doesn't always happen, sometimes when you attempt to correct a piece of misinformation that someone holds, perhaps you have tried to discuss something with your family, and when you confront them with the correct information, the person, the respondent in this case, actually will believe the false claim more strongly. So even when presented with correct information, in some instances, we also see something called backfire effects. And that just means you have shown them correct information, and it actually makes the person cling to false information, misinformation, more strongly, okay? Now, there are circumstances in which accuracy will likely win out, okay? So it's more likely to correct misinformation when the issue is less salient, So you will likely be able to persuade someone that is misinformed on an issue that is not that much of a hot button issue. Say something like transportation policy, right? That's not usually a hot button issue. It's much more difficult to persuade people or correct misinformation on issues that are really controversial or oftentimes salient. So things like abortion or healthcare, those are more difficult issues to correct misinformation on. You can see the death panels with the Affordable Care Act. That was very difficult to correct that misinformation once people held that view. The other thing is that it's more likely to, you're more likely to have correctly reshape someone's view of something or correct that misinformation when the correction doesn't threaten that person's worldview, okay? So if that view is if that opinion is very central to what they believe, it's unlikely that you're going to correct that misinformation. And again, this sort of goes back to credibility. It's when the correction comes from someone who's aligned with your partisanship. So if the correction comes from a Democrat, if you're a Democrat, if the correction comes from a Republican, if you're a Republican, or, and here's the other thing, or if the source is completely apolitical. They are not aligned with any political interests in people's minds. So the example was sort of an online algorithm. That was what previous research had shown, that if it was an online algorithm seen to be neutral, that we would be more likely to see a correction occur. Okay. But, and here's the tricky thing, sometimes people will report that they believe in misinformation, but there are concerns that people don't actually mean it. So there are questions about sincerity. And this is called expressive responding. So this occurs when people intentionally provide misinformation for the purposes of reaffirming their partisan identity. And there are a few studies on this. And if you give people monetary incentives, if you compensate them for correct answers, you are more likely to see people report correct answers. So like not misinformed answers. So in other words, the partisan responses are less likely. So there are questions really about how sincere this misinformation we're seeing on surveys really is. Like how much do people really believe this misinformation? It may be more a signaling of their partisan views as opposed to their actual belief. Because if they are responding more correctly in the face of monetary incentives, then they likely do know that their current beliefs are not correct, right? That misinformation is not correct, okay? Now, what we covered here today is defining misinformation and sort of situating it in comparison to conspiracies versus rumors versus being uninformed. We also talked about what motivates people to believe in misinformation, specifically accuracy and directional motives, and grounding that in motivated reasoning. Then we talked about how to correct misinformation. Guess what, everyone? It's hard. And then also backfire effects, which is particularly problematic because in the face of correct information, people might cling to that misinformation more tightly, right? They're less likely to correct that information. And then finally, and this is more of a new line of research, probably in the past couple of years, about sincerity. So for a long time, we were like, misinformation is a big, big problem. But now we're calling into question whether people even truly believe this misinformation or if they see it more as a partisan cue, right? Like they're just sort of expressing their partisanship by perpetuating misinformation. But we will talk about this all a bit more in our discussion section, and I will see you there.